Dr. Harris is a professor of post-secondary education and co-director of the Community College Equity Assessment Lab, CEAL, at San Diego State University. He is best known for his expertise in racial inequity in post-secondary education and has made important contributions to knowledge about college student development and the social construction of gender and race in college contexts. His work prioritizes populations that have been historically underrepresented and underserved in education. Harris's scholarship has been published in leading journals for higher education and student affairs research and practice. He has also delivered more than 1,000 academic and professional presentations throughout his career. His commentary has been sought by several high-profile media outlets, including CNN, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and the Chronicle of Higher Education, to name but a few. Harris is also regularly consulted by colleges and universities across the country for his expertise on student equity, student success, and institutional transformation. Before joining the faculty at San Diego State, Harris worked as a student affairs educator and college administrator in the areas of student affairs administration, student crisis support, and advocacy. New student orientation programs, multicultural student affairs, academic advising, and enrollment services. He also served as an adjunct professor of speech communication at Los Angeles Trade Technical College. Harris earned a bachelor's degree in communication studies at Loyola Marymount University, a master's degree in speech communication at California State University Northridge, and a doctorate in higher education from the Rossier School of Education at the University of Southern California. The equity principles Dr. Harris discusses with us today, coupled with the ongoing collaboration of the GDEC, ODEI, IDC, staff, faculty, and administration, will help guide our 2021 action plan, one in which Green River has the chance to refine our mission of think student first, then decide, to a more encompassing think equity first, then decide. For my part, after viewing just a small sampling of Dr. Harris's body of work, I was moved to make immediate changes and adjustments to my own courses. I could go on about his unflagging dedication to historically underrepresented and underserved populations in higher education, but we really don't have that kind of time. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Frank Harris III.
Thank you so much, Georgina, for the wonderful introduction. That was, as I was saying, by far the best introduction I've ever received as a speaker, and I'm grateful to you for the time that you spent to prepare that. Also, just want to thank everyone, the entire Green River College community, just for allowing me to be a part of this important conversation, just at such an incredibly critical time in our country's history. Of course, I also want to give a special shout out to President Johnson for prioritizing racial equity and by providing this space and platform for us to have an opportunity to speak transparently about it. I think we all know that there are many places and institutions where opportunities to engage in critical dialogue about race and its implications for our work as educators is they're not welcome nor invited. And so I appreciate President Johnson for her leadership in this regard. And of course, I also want to thank Tanya McLavy and Wendy Stewart, with whom I had the opportunity to work closely in my preparation for this engagement. And especially thankful to Tanya for sending me this wonderful Green River College sweatshirt and encouraging me to actually wear it as I deliver this address, just to be a part of the Gator spirit. And so I'm grateful to you, Tanya, for that. In terms of the remarks that I've prepared today that I hope that's going to inform our conversation, there are three objectives. Of course, we're going to talk about issues related to racism and racial equity and how do they impact the experiences of, it says students of color, but I should also say people of color in academia. We're going to talk about some institutional barriers, persistent barriers that make it difficult to close racial equity gaps. And then perhaps most importantly, I'm going to talk about some strategies that I have found helpful and insightful in my work to transform institutions with the particular focus on racial equity. To tell you all a little bit, just a small snapshot, of the work that I lead at San Diego State University as a professor and as co-director of the Community College Equity Assessment Lab. This is a lab that I started with my colleague, Dr. J. Luke Wood, who some of you may know and who I'll reference at least 2 more times during our time together today. But Luke and I started SEAL almost a decade ago with the hope and expectation that we will work with community colleges across the country to institutionalize equity. We've been successful in doing that in a number of different ways. And we primarily pursue this mission by 3 primary ways. First and foremost, by using assessment and inquiry as a tool for capacity building. So we've developed surveys, we've developed protocols, we've developed quite a few qualitative tools as well to inform this part of our mission. We also are, just by virtue of being professors at a research university, we're heavily involved in both conducting and disseminating empirical research. And then quite a bit of our work is pursued through professional learning experiences. So, prior to COVID-19, Luke and I were probably spending anywhere from 2 to 3 times per month at a college, most often a community college like Green River, just talking with colleagues and engaging with colleagues, much in a way that we will do today via Zoom. And so a lot of the insights, nearly all of the insights that I'll share today are just informed by a lot of meaningful and deep partnerships with community colleges over the past nearly a decade. And as we transition into the content of our discussion today, I think it's really important that we have a shared understanding of what equity is and what it means. I think equity is a word that we're certainly hearing more often than, say, we did a decade ago. And I think to a certain degree, sometimes we lose sight and lose perspective on what it is and what it means. We know at its core, equity is really about enacting intentional strategies to address disparities that impact students who experience what we call disproportionate impact. Long story short, disproportionate impact means that there are students who are not benefiting from their participation in post-secondary education as much as other students. And then we know from our work that there are groups that consistently experience disproportionate impact on almost every indicator of student success, notably the students that you see represented here on the screen. That being said, I also want to acknowledge that by no means is this an exhaustive list. We know that there are other populations that are not presented here that are also deeply disproportionately impacted in education. And I also want to acknowledge that there is a lot of intersectionality that exists, amongst these groups as well. So we know that a student can be a racially minoritized student and also a former foster youth and so forth. And while much of our discussion about equity today is going to focus on racial equity, and that's prioritized because of where we are as a country and some of the things that have emerged as or I should say reemerged as priorities, should be priorities for all of us as educators. We know that equity is ultimately about closing disparities for all students. Some of you may be rightfully wondering, who are our disproportionately impacted students at Green River College? And to answer this question, we can just easily take a look at some of the most recent student success data, some data that were shared by me. And I should also say that, the data and the analysis that are shared were just incredibly rich and insightful. And so I really do appreciate having access to this in preparation for today's remarks. But when we look at some of these data and disaggregated by race, ethnicity, and we start by looking at students who graduate from Green River College's high school feeders, we can see that patterns of disproportionate impact start to take hold, fairly early on. So I want to direct your attention to the second set of bars, the ones that have the arrows directed above them for each group. And what's apparent here is that in comparison to their white and Asian peers, American Indian, Black, and Hispanic students are less likely to matriculate to post-secondary education upon completing high school, right? And then, of course, I also want to, I'm sure that there are others who notice the clear disparities that exist in the rates of high school completion between these groups as well. And while our focus is on what happens in post-secondary education, I do think it's important to it's important and appropriate to highlight these disparities as well. Now, let's take a look at what happens to those who are fortunate enough to matriculate to post-secondary education, and in particular to Green River College. Presented here are data that shows the percentage of students within each racial ethnic group who successfully complete their units attempted during their first quarter at Green River College. So to orient you to this data a little bit for those who haven't had the opportunity to see it, the tallest bars shows those who complete all units attempted, right? So that's obviously a desirable outcome, something that we want to see. The red bars shows those who complete some units attempted, but not all of them. And then the dark blue bars, the ones with the arrows directed to them, shows those who did not complete any units, any of their attempted units in their first quarter. And it's this latter group that raises the most concern for me. And while only 8% of Asian and 10% of white students are in the no units completed group, we see that nearly a quarter of Black and Pacific Islander students are in this group. And 14% of multiracial students and 13% of Hispanic students are also amongst those who did not complete units during their first quarter at Green River College. And, you know, for the skeptics who are saying, well, maybe this is just a first semester situation or first quarter situation, I do want to add that we see a similar pattern when we look at the units completed at the end of the first year. Again, 6% of Asian, 9% of white students complete no units at the end of the first year compared to 12% for multiracial. We see the numbers actually for Hispanic students get, you know, a little bit better than they did from the first quarter data. But look at what happens with our Pacific Islander and Black students, right? Where 22% and 20% of those students did not complete units at the end of the first year. And, you know, of course, when we take a deeper look at disaggregated student success data, we get an even more transparent picture of who's disproportionately impacted at Green River College and why. And again, I have to say, as a researcher and someone who's very passionate about student success, I really love this particular analysis. I really love because it just smacks you in the face with regard to helping to highlight disparities. But depicted here are course success rates for the courses with the highest enrollment, that had the highest enrollment at Green River College during the fall 2018 term. So, you know, we take all the enrollments of every class that was offered at the college in the fall of 2018. These are the top 20 in terms of those that had the highest number of students enrolled. Highlighted in red are those whose success rates were lower than the overall rate for the college, right? So for example, if we look at English 101, which just happens to, I'm not picking on English, this just happens to be the first class on our list here, right? We see that the overall success rate for all students who are in that course in the fall of 18 term was 81%. And then, you know, we see that Native American students had a rate that was, you know, significantly lower, which is why they're highlighted in red. And again, as we can see, when we sort of look overall at all 20 courses, sort of look at them, you know, as a collective, we see that Black students, Hispanic students, and to a somewhat lesser degree, but still, you know, to a concerning degree, Native American students had success rates that were consistently lower than the overall rates for the college. And then, you know, finally, this is the last data point that I'll share here, is when we look at the rates of fall to fall retention for the first year, we see that American Indian, Black, and Pacific Islander students have rates that are lower than the 49% average for all colleges, right? And substantially lower than the 60% rate for Asian students. And so, you know, typically when we look at data like this, and I think as educators, you know, we often get the opportunity to look at student success data. And if we're lucky, we get to have conversations with colleagues about it. And I would say in many ways, the typical response to these type of data is sort of what we see here. We're often compelled to ask what's wrong with the students. And why aren't these students doing what it takes for them to be successful here? Now, I will say this, this is not an unreasonable question when one considers the fact that it represents what we call a traditional paradigm of student success. What that means is that it's a perspective on student success that focuses almost exclusively on what students do or don't do, and it completely ignores the role that educators and institutions play in allowing inequity, like the inequities we got the opportunity to look at, and allowing inequities to exist and persist. And so, part of what I want to offer today is an opportunity for us to engage in a paradigm shift and to not look at things strictly from a traditional student success perspective, but to look at what Estella Ben-Simone calls equity-mindedness. And equity-mindedness is important because it is essentially the linchpin of equity. And what Dr. Ben-Simone tells us is that in describing some key elements of equity-mindedness, is that equity-mindedness first and foremost entails being systemically aware. So what that means is that we have to understand that the same students who are disproportionately impacted in post-secondary education, they're not just disproportionately impacted in that context. They're also not well served in the K-12 context. They're not well served outside of education. So when we think about healthcare, we think about the workforce, the criminal justice system. So, while our focus and our locus of control is in education, we have to recognize that with regard to inequity, we're really dealing with a systemic issue. Second, we have to look at equity or inequity, I should say, from an institutional responsibility and accountability perspective. Means it's not just asking what's wrong with the students. It also means asking what is wrong with us as educators, what is wrong with our institution, how can we be better in serving these students. We also have to be race conscious, and I'm going to talk about that in a couple minutes. Race conscious in the sense that we cannot see students' racial identities as liabilities. We actually have to see them as assets that can be leveraged to facilitate their success. We have to reflect critically on who we are as educators, what are our roles and responsibilities in allowing inequity talk about as educators. But education is a caring profession. It's a caring profession, much in the same sense that, being a psychologist is or being a physician. And so, we really have to care about our students. We have to have a vested interest in who they are. So it's not just about caring about them in a casual sense, but it's about caring about them in a real genuine sense. And it's also about having a personal investment in who they are. I also think it's important to acknowledge that, and it perhaps comes as no surprise that.
Oh, okay. Sorry, it's been a long time since I answered a call from on campus, and it took me a minute to figure it out.
Sorry, getting a little bit of feedback there.
Hey, Linda, you're not muted in Zoom.
Yep, I'm good to go. Okay, awesome. Okay, yeah. So again, I think we all know that COVID-19, this pandemic that has changed our world seemingly overnight, that it has also required us to think even more deeply about what it means to be an equity-minded educator. As we all know also, or perhaps we all know, that this pandemic has been really challenging for everyone, but it's been especially challenging and it's had a disproportionate effect on communities of color. And so our efforts to serve students in this context means that, we have to be racially conscious, of course, but we also have to pay special attention to what we call digital equity. And digital equity is not just about making sure that students have access to a laptop and have access to broadband, although those are important, but it also means that we have to think even more deeply about what does equity mean in this remote learning context, and how do we make sure that all students, especially those who are disproportionately impacted in education, have what they need in order to meaningfully access these virtual learning spaces and to make meaningful contributions within them as well. And, you know, I've said this a couple times already, but I do want to, you know, be transparent in saying that being equity minded is also being race conscious, also sits at the core of being equity minded. It's not to say that other forms of oppression and discrimination are not important and should not be acknowledged, but it also reminds us that we cannot substitute race and it cannot be overlooked in our efforts to achieve educational equity. And, you know, given everything that we've talked about so far, I also recognize that knowing what equity is and knowing what equity mindedness is, and being able to define it is one thing, but actually caring about it as an issue in and of itself is a different thing and a different challenge. And so in addressing this question, right, those who ask, well, why should I really care about this equity stuff? And in particular, why should I care about racial equity? I do want to offer what I think are 4 very compelling reasons why we all need to be mindful and intentional in prioritizing racial equity in our work. You know, the first, again, we know that community colleges is colleges like Green River College that is the primary pathway to post-secondary education for the overwhelming majority of students who have been historically underrepresented and underserved in education. If it were not for a Green River College or another community college, there are many students who would not have a path to a post-secondary degree or credential, whatever it may be, right? So we absolutely have to care about equity here, because if we don't, then what happens after is you know, it may not even be relevant at that point. Second, we've talked about this a little bit, but the traditional paradigm of student success is just no longer effective in meeting the needs of today's current student population. We have a student population that's more diverse, that's older, you know, in terms of having more adult learners. We have students who are working full-time and attending part-time. And so the traditional paradigm, the paradigm that many of us perhaps found success in and that allowed us to be, you know, be good, quote unquote, good students and achieve success in education, that paradigm doesn't really work for the vast majority of today's college students. This third one is another important point that I think is worth acknowledging, is that the country's top economists have warned us that we cannot meet our country's social and economic needs without having a more college-educated population. And what they often highlight as the attainment benchmark where we need to be as a country is about 60%. So we need 60% of adults, right? So 25 to 30-year-olds in the United States to have a post-secondary degree or credential by the year, well, it was the year 2020 it was the initial projection, and some have extended it out to 2025. I can say this, prior to the pandemic, we were on pace to reach 60% in the year 2048. Now, we know that when we think about the devastating effect that the pandemic is going to have on, you know, every sector and every social institution in our country, you know, we could easily extend that timeline even further. And when we have a country that's becoming more diverse, we really cannot afford to have a throwaway group, right? This has to be a priority for all of us. And, you know, this last point is one that I think is worth mentioning, is that being an educator is a tremendous privilege, but it also comes with tremendous responsibility. And so I say everyone who works at a college has an obligation, has both an opportunity and an obligation to make sure that students experience our campuses in ways that are safe, that are welcoming, and that contribute to success in meaningful ways. And given all of this, everything that we've talked about already, and even those of us who really truly believe in an authentic way that equity, and in particular racial equity, is an important objective for all colleges and for all educators, we know that achieving racial equity is really, really hard to do. And what I want to do is highlight what I think are some persistent barriers, right? So these are some things that I have consistently encountered in my work with colleges over the years that we have found just tend to serve as persistent barriers to achieving racial equity. For the sake of time, we're not going to have the opportunity to talk about each and every one of these, but there are a handful that I would like to highlight here. The first, starting with deficit perspectives. Deficit perspectives are in many ways self-fulfilling prophecies. If we believe that a student does not belong here being in our class, in our departments, on our campus, whatever it may be, or we believe that a student is not capable of being successful, it will have an impact on the ways in which we teach and the ways in which we serve that student. And it will be reflected in the vibe and the energy that we convey and in our motivation to go the extra mile for that student. I'll speak a little bit personally here. I think Georgina in her introduction shared that I had the very earlier in my career, almost 2 decades ago. I had the opportunity to work as an adjunct faculty member at LA Trade Technical College. For those who may not be familiar with LA Trade Tech, it's a community college. It's situated in the middle of downtown Los Angeles, right, and just in a major urban community. And I taught Introduction to Public Speaking on Thursday evenings from 7 p.m. to 10 p.m. So, that can kind of give you a sense of who the students were that I served. So these were students who were working adults, who were, working all day, coming to class, doing the best that they can do, and with tremendous family responsibilities and other commitments and obligations and so forth. And I can honestly say when I reflect on that experience, the students who did well in my classes were the ones that I actually believe would do well. And somewhat embarrassed to admit, but I think in the spirit of transparency here, I could also say that the students who struggled were more often than not the ones who I did not necessarily believe in or did not go out of my way to support when they encountered challenges and difficulty. And so we have to be mindful about our perspectives about students. We have to be mindful about our perspective on what a good student looks like, or what a worthy of or deserving student looks like, and what student success looks like, especially in today's context. Moving on to a couple of other things I want to highlight is when we have a poor conceptualization of what equity means and how to practice it. Of course, we spent a little bit of time today talking about what equity is, and I got to share a definition with you, and we talked a little bit about disproportionate impact. But we have colleagues who really believe that equity is about lowering standards and lowering rigor, or another group of colleagues who feel like who when they say equity, they really mean equality because they believe that you have to give every student the same thing. And one thing that we know is that you cannot close equity gaps by giving every student the same thing, right? You have to identify students who need more support, more resources in order to close equity gaps and to be successful. And then this last point I'd like to highlight is toxic resistance and toxic support. In doing so, I'm going to share a framework, and just a quick heads up, I'm a big fan of frameworks. I like taxonomies. So I'm going to share a few of those today. So if you love it, that's awesome. If you're not really into frameworks, I apologize in advance, but I think they're really helpful in kind of helping to make sense of not only make sense of complex phenomenon, but also for me as a speaker, I just find that they really help me explain them a bit more clearly and a little bit more transparently. So bear with me in that regard, but this is the first of several. And this is a taxonomy that Luke and I developed a few years ago because we were encountering a wide range of perspectives on equity, and we felt like we needed to have something to make sense of what we were encountering. And we felt like the colleagues we were working with at our colleges needed to have a tool as well. And so what you see here is that taxonomy. It has two constructs. The first construct is represented at the top of the taxonomy with the labels, know what to do and don't know what to do. And we can think about that as just competence, right? Competence meaning that I know what equity is, I know what equity-mindedness is, and I have a good understanding of how to practice it and how to do it, right? So if I teach psychology and I'm an equity-minded psychology professor, then I know what it means to make sure that I'm infusing diverse perspectives in psychology. I'm using teaching and learning strategies that are applicable to a wide range of learners. I'm using intrusive practices to reach my students who are struggling and are not doing well. So you know what equity is, you know what equity-mindedness is, and you practice it on a regular basis, right? So that's competence. Now, the second construct is situated at the left, and we can think about that construct as motivation. Because one thing we know is that it's not enough to just know something. You actually have to be motivated to use and apply the tools or apply the knowledge in a way that's value added to your practice as an educator. Okay, so we have competence at the top, we have motivation on the left, and of course you can see we could be motivated, which means that we have a willingness to employ equity-minded practices in our work, or we could be unwilling to do that. And I will say this, this taxonomy applies whether you're a faculty member, whether you're a counselor or an advisor. It applies to any educator on a college or university campus. Okay, so let's start with the box at the very top right that's labeled KW. This captures the perspective of those who know what equity-mindedness is, they practice it on a regular basis, and perhaps predictably, we call this group the choir. And we call them the choir because more often than not, it's the choir that's leading equity efforts and conversations on their campuses. Next, we have the allies, right? When we shift to the left, the top left of the taxonomy, long story short, the only thing that separates the allies from the choir is that the allies haven't had the coaching, they haven't had the professional development, they just haven't had the opportunity to learn what equity-mindedness is, or to learn what equity-minded practices are, and to actually infuse it into what they do with students. However, if you give them the opportunity to learn it, they could just as easily become a part of the choir, right? So we have the choir, we have the allies. Of course, some of you are thinking it would be great if we could just stop there, problem solved, but of course, we can't. There's other perspectives we have to consider, like the one at the bottom left that we call the resistors. Now, the resistors haven't embraced equity-mindedness. They don't see it as necessary, and they're just not motivated to do it. Now, we find that there are two types of resistors: active resistors and passive resistors. Active resistors are simply the ones who are most vocal and most forthcoming in their opposition to equity efforts. So they're the ones that are saying, why are we doing this? This is a waste of time. We're coddling students. They want to get rid of rigor. Who's this Frank Harris guy? Why is he coming to speak to us? What a sham, what a fraud, right? So that's sort of what you get from an active resistor. Now, here's what we also know. Most resistors are not active resistors. Now, we often think that they represent a larger contingent than they do, because they are, again, they're very forthcoming about how they feel. But the fact of the matter is most resistors are actually passive resistors. And what that means is that they're not going to be as vocal, they're not going to be as transparent, but they're also going to avoid any and every opportunity to be authentically engaged in anything that has to do with equity. So they're not going to say anything, but they're also not going to do anything. And then we have the defiant. Now, these are the folks who have been trained, they have a good understanding of equity, they know what equity-mindedness is, but they refuse to enact these practices, at least refuse to enact them with the students who need the support the most. So they might be more willing to do equity-related or equity-minded stuff with students they like, or students who they readily identify with, or the students who work in their research, in their chemistry lab or whatever it may be. But they're not necessarily willing to do the work with the students who need the most support. And now here's another interesting thing. There was a time when Luke and I, not long ago, we were presenting this framework at a conference. And to make a long story short, after the presentation, a colleague told us that this is a very, very good, interesting taxonomy, makes a lot of sense. I like it. Good job, but it's missing something. So he said, what about those who think they're equity minded, who think they're part of the choir, but they really have no idea what they're doing? And so Luke and I reflected on that question, for a little bit of time, and decided to add a fifth group to our taxonomy. And this group is one that we call the oblivious. And we call this group the oblivious because one can arrive at being oblivious, and usually in one of three ways. The first is when we do the work from a savior complex, right? When we believe that our work is about saving students as opposed to empowering students and helping them identify their strengths as learners and leveraging those strengths and eliminating institutional barriers and getting out of the way, right? So we got to understand equity work is not about saving students. It's about empowering students. But we can also be non-reflective in our work. Sometimes our actions are not aligned with the values and the principles that we espouse. So we can talk about equity and equity-mindedness, and we could talk about, racial equity. But when you look at the way that we work with students, the way that we teach them or advise them or support them, what we're saying is not necessarily aligned with what we're advocating, what we're doing, pardon me. And then the last one is what we call grandstanding. And grandstanding occurs when our commitment to equity is really more about developing a reputation for it, or advancing our careers, or being perceived a certain way by our colleagues than it is about institutional transformation and doing what's right and doing what's best for students. And so what this taxonomy does is a couple things. It's helpful for a couple of reasons. The first is to recognize where we are in this, right? And to recognize that none of us are always a part of the choir, right? There's some of us where we might be a part of the choir for one group of students, but we're defiant or resistant when it comes to other groups, right? So recognizing that no matter where we are and how good we are, how good we think we are, we all still have more work to do to build our capacity to truly be equity-minded educators. And the second part of it is to recognize that when we're engaging our colleagues in conversation and work about equity, that we have to recognize where they are. And part of recognizing where they are is also recognizing that we're not going to be able to motivate and engage everyone with the same message, right? And so we talk about the 4 E's. So with the choir, we have to empower the choir. So the choir has to know what you're doing. It's important. It's aligned with what the research says is important. It's value added for students. It's value added for our institution. Keep doing it. The allies need more education, more professional learning. They need the opportunity to build their capacity to be equity-minded educators, right? So more exposure to readings and speakers and perspectives about equity and equity-mindedness. And more important than that, more models with how to infuse it into the work that they're doing, right? So thinking this has some implications for how we onboard new employees, all sorts of things when it comes to, building capacity for equity. With our passive resistors and the defiant, we have to encourage them to care, right? Because part of the challenge with both of these groups is they don't really see the value in this. And they really don't see the value as it relates to them and things that are important for them. And so part of what we have to do is to figure out how do we connect these equity goals and our equity agenda to things that are important to them. And then with the oblivious, we have to enlighten the oblivious, right? So that means we have to have critical but collegial conversations with them. So it's, Frank, I really appreciate you. You bring a real important perspective to this. But when we're in a search committee meeting and you say this, right, or we're looking at student success data and you say that there's nothing we can really do for these students because they don't value education or they come from families and communities that don't value education. Well, that doesn't really help advance us and move us forward in a way that's meaningful and in a way that's going to be value added, right? So it's sort of helping them to see the disconnect between what they say and what they do. And now given that, and given the conversation we just had about educators, we also need to have a conversation about students and get a better sense of what are students' lived experiences as they matriculate, in particular, into community college. And so in order to ground that conversation, again, I'm sorry, yet another framework. For those who don't like frameworks, I warned you and I apologize. But what I want to do here is highlight some key constructs from another framework that Luke and I developed called the social ecological outcomes model. And I promise all of this stuff is all going to come together by the end of our time together. So just stay with me and bear with me. But anyway, so what you see here is an abbreviated version of the model. At the far left of the model are what we describe as inputs. So, this is the stuff that students bring with them as they matriculate to community college, right? So experiences and backgrounds and, all the things that are valued, that are salient in their experiences as learners, right? So they come with that as they matriculate into community college. The middle of the model is what we call our social ecological domains. And each domain includes factors that have a significant influence on students' experiences, their relationships, and ultimately their success in community college. And finally, at the far right of the model, what we're seeing here is that it's the interactions and all the constructs that exist within and between these domains that ultimately influence student success, which is, of course, in a community college, student success is not just graduating with an associate's degree or transferring to a university, or in the case of Green River College, you all award bachelor's degrees. So that's a part of your student success, menu of student success outcomes. But we have to have a broad perspective on what student success means when we're talking about community college students, because community colleges have a much broader mission than other post-secondary institutions, and so forth, right? And so this is, again, what the model looks like when it's neatly packaged. And this is what it looks like when all of the constructs are revealed. Now, I have to say this, when we first developed this model, we would kind of start with the slide that you see here. And then we would literally lose half the audience would go away. And so I said, okay, Luke, we can't start here. We got to start with something that's a little more visually appealing. So this looks pretty good, right? But this is a abbreviated version of this. But what I am going to do is highlight a few constructs here. I'm not going to highlight everything. I'm not going to talk about everything. But these points I'm going to highlight just give us a real deeper understanding of the experiences of disproportionately impacted students. Why are they disproportionately impacted? And where does racial equity come into play in all of this, right? And that'll take us to another important conversation. But so first, we have our societal factors. And this construct captures social issues that influence underserved students' dispositions towards education and how they see themselves as learners. For example, right, one example to highlight here is social stereotypes. Stereotypes about who students of color are, their intellectual capabilities, their fit for college, all of that stuff exists, within this part of the model. To further highlight what I mean by this is yet another framework, but we call this the 3D effect. Basically, what the 3D effect does is it highlights the three most prevailing racial stereotypes that are held by educators of racially minoritized students. The first D at the very top here is called distrust, and distrust relates to an assumption of criminality. And this is where we assume that students of color, especially men of color, are associated with being thugs, deviants, and criminals. And I'm going to talk more about that. Actually in the next slide. So hang tight there. The second D at the right of the model is disregard. And this relates to an description of intelligence. Here we assume that students of color are not only underprepared for college, but also intellectually inferior to white students and Asian students. And then finally, we have disdain, which assumes that people of color come from families and communities that don't value education. The key point here is that these stereotypes are often unconsciously held by educators and have an influence on the ways in which they teach and serve students of color. To give you a little bit more detail about each of these, assumption of criminality, again, is when we assume a person of color is criminal, deviant, or dangerous based on race. Here's some examples of some statements that I've heard over the years that are directly aligned with an assumption of criminality looks like, right? I'm not going to read them to you, but this gives you a sense of what some of these things are. Our second one, description of intelligence, right? When we assign a degree of intelligence to a person based on race. Here's some examples of some things that we see here that relates to a description of intelligence. Not going to read them to you, but you can take a look at them. And then our third stereotype is pathologizing culture. And, again, this occurs when people make derogatory statements about communities of color and assume people of color who come from communities of color are not value added to educational context. We often hear people say things like some of the things we see represented here. By the way, my discussion and what I'm talking about here is focused on students. These same stereotypes also apply to colleagues, so faculty and other educators as well. So just be mindful of that as well. So that gives you a sense of some of the factors and issues that shape students of color's dispositions towards learning as they matriculate into community college. Now think about this. Think about these three patterns and think about if you experience them on a somewhat regular basis, almost daily basis for some students, beginning in preschool, and you heard that and you felt that all the way through high school. And if you decided not to go right into college, right out of high school, you dealt with a lot of these same issues in your workplace and so forth, and in your neighborhood, right? And so, some folks are probably thinking, okay, well, they made the transition to college, so they must not be that bad. But we got to understand that some students make it to Green River College despite of the trauma and all the baggage and all the bad things that they've experienced. And that's why we have to be mindful of some of these issues as educators, especially, in 2020 when we're dealing with a lot of trauma and a lot of, racialized trauma to begin with. But returning to our model, we also have the non-cognitive domain. Now, the non-cognitive domain is primarily consists of variables that are psychosocial in nature, right? So we're dealing with identity constructs and things like that. And they capture students' emotional and affective responses to the social context of the institution, as well as the person-environment interactions that take place within it. So, for example, to highlight a couple things here, the extent to which students believe they're capable of being successful in college is self-efficacy. The amount of personal control they assume they have for their success relates to what we call a locus of control. Degree utility relates to the value that students place on obtaining a college degree or certificate. I'm going to give some examples of that construct shortly. And then the energy that they invest towards their academic endeavors is what we call action control. They all come into play in shaping success for students of color. We can expect also that COVID-19 is likely going to have a significant impact on all of these factors, right? So we got to think about that and what does that mean? To highlight just a few examples here, action control. This is a quote from one of our focus group participants. Not going to read it to you, but essentially what the student is saying is that he's a college student. He's got two younger siblings who are also college students, and he has a mother who is struggling with cancer. And he really finds it difficult when he's at school to really focus and compartmentalize what's happening at home. And then when he's at home, he finds it really hard to focus on taking care of his mom because he's thinking about his schoolwork, right? So this is a student who's really, struggling with the issue of what we call action control. And action control, again, is, when everything is going on outside of the class or outside of school or whatever it is, do I have the capacity to really compartmentalize and at least focus for the hour or two that I'm here and that I'm in class, right? Degree utility. We know that a lot of students, even when they make the transition and make the decision to enroll in college, they really struggle with this little voice in their head that's saying, you know, are you sure this is worth being here? You had a really good job. You have a family to take care of, right? You have children to feed. You have parents that are relying on you. Is the sacrifice really going to be worth it, right? Is it just really a worthy pursuit at this time? And then we also have, you know, we didn't get into the details about this, but we also have identity constructs that come into play as well. So what we have here is a student who really is talking about his struggles with seeking help. This is really salient, especially amongst men of color, really struggle with help seeking. I've had a lot of conversations with men of color who says, yep, I know I have support. I know, you know, there's this center on campus. I know that there's that going on, but I have a hard time asking for help because it's really aligned with my identity and who I am and how I see myself as a man. And if I need help, then maybe it does mean that I don't belong here. And so there could be a real conflict and a real challenge with that. Returning to the model, we have the academic domain. I'm not going to provide examples of this because in many ways, the academic domain, it consists of student-faculty interactions, students' use of academic services, their commitment to course of study, and other variables that are directly related to the student academic experiences. I will say this, when we think about the shift to remote learning and the impact of COVID-19, we do have to be mindful and wonder, how is that going to really be salient in the academic domain, especially when we think about students who made a decision to attend in person because they felt like in person was probably the best experience for them, and they no longer have the opportunity to do that. And then we have the environmental domain. Now, this is the domain that captures everything that's happening outside of the context of the college, like employment, family responsibility, transportation concerns, stressful life events like divorce and legal concerns and death of a family member or death of a close friend or health issues, to name a few. And while we as educators often assume that we have little influence over these factors, although that's debatable, and we can talk about that a little bit later, we have to recognize their impact on students' experiences and success. And so again, we can expect COVID-19, right? We can expect George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, right? And all of the stuff that's just been happening just in 2020 alone. And students who have had to deal with employment challenges and being laid off or being essential workers, and right, that it is likely going to have a real significant impact on students' engagement and success. And then I'm going to skip this next slide here and talk about what we see with regard to employment. We know from our work that students of color tend to be concentrated in jobs that have these three characteristics. They're in jobs that are physically demanding, so they're working construction, they're stocking shelves, they're doing physically exhausting work. They're also in jobs that tend to be temporary or transitional in nature. So they're in a job for these few months. That job ends. Now I have to transition to another job. And maybe that transition happens in the middle of the semester, right around midterms. And the previous job I had a real cool supervisor who knew I was a college student, who was very supportive, who gave me the hours I needed to go to school. But I no longer have that. Now I have a new supervisor who's not really as supportive. And so now I got to really reorient everything that I do in order to work and continue to go to school, not to mention the impact that it might have on my family responsibilities, right? And then they're also in jobs that occur late night or overnight. I can't tell you how many times I'd be engaged in a focus group with students, and we'd just be talking informally, and they'll say, yeah, I just got off work. It's early in the morning. It's 8 o'clock. I just got off work. Wow, what time did you get off work? Oh, I got off at 2 a.m. this morning. Really? Okay. Well, what time is your first class? 8 a.m. Okay. Wow. So that's really challenging. And so anyhow, these are some of the stressors and some of the things that we see in the environmental domain. And then lastly, we have the campus ethos domain. Now, this is the domain where institutional policies and programs and campus resources and the day-to-day practices that shape the way students experience and succeed in community college, they're all represented here in this campus ethos domain. This is also the domain that we have the most control over as educators, right? This is where we look at practices and relationships that convey validation, sense of belonging, authentic care, and where we create a climate that affirms students' identities. And again, when we apply this domain to COVID-19, and we talk about the critical need to be intrusive in supporting students by being proactive and providing them the resources and information they'll need before they need it, right? This is all a part of the campus ethos domain. And to give a couple of examples here, just a few, right? Some students talked about some good things that have happened for them in the campus ethos domain. One student talked about a relationship with a professor that was motivating, where the professor was willing to provide some unusual and additional support. Some students really appreciate the fact that their faculty members are making their slideshows, their PowerPoint presentations more diverse, right? As simple as that may sound. And then others talk about motivation, right? And really feeling motivated and really feeling energized when they're in a class and the professor feels energized and feels motivated, right? And these are some things here that really speak to the issue of the campus ethos domain. For those of you that are not working with students, in terms of teaching classes, again, the same thing applies with regard to working with students outside of the classroom, developing good relationships with them, being positive, being motivated. All of the same rules apply. And so we've been going here for about an hour. And what I want to do now is give you an opportunity to engage in some dialogue with your colleagues. Now, I know this is a really big group, a fairly large group. So I'm going to try to do this and get us in the breakout rooms. And before I do that, I do want to give you the opportunity to look at a question that I'd like you to talk with your colleagues about in breakout rooms. So given everything that we've talked about, and we've talked about a lot so far, and we have a lot more to talk about, but taking everything that we've talked about so far, what institutional actions from your perspective are necessary to improve the experiences and success of racially minoritized students? And so I'm going to put us in breakout rooms. If you sense any hesitation in my voice, it's because I am a little bit nervous to do it, but I think it's going to work out. I'm going to actually give us, let's say, about 7 minutes to have this conversation. What I'll also do is invite folks to, when we reconvene in 7 minutes, to kind of share the highlights of their conversation. Obviously, we won't get to hear from every group. What I would appreciate is if each group can identify a spokesperson. So before you break, say, okay, Georgina, you're going to be the person that shares. And I'm not putting Georgina on the spot, so it doesn't have to be you, Georgina. But choose someone who's willing to provide, a 30-second or so summary of the group's conversation. All right. So I'm going to put us in breakout groups. We're going to go for about 7 minutes. We'll reconvene. We'll hear from a few groups, and then we'll talk about some more implications for racial equity. Any volunteers that would like to briefly summarize some of the institutional actions that you all came up with?
Well, I think I'll go ahead and volunteer. I think one of the primary things is the hiring policy and the hiring practices at the institution. Oftentimes, hiring committees are sort of quickly arranged, and a status quo methodology is used from beginning until end. And I think that this is, over the decades, has impeded the hiring of faculty of color. I'm coming from the English division. And so a paradigm shift in the hiring practices and methodologies from start to finish has to be addressed. There's been some work through GDEC in doing this, creating the Equities Rep program and whatnot. But more people need to get on board with how that process goes, and especially how those job announcements are advertised, where they're going out to, instead of just falling back on the same methods that haven't worked.
I would agree with that. And I would say it's not just, I mean, that's part of it, but also we need training on how we respond to our applicants and how we hear them and whether or not we're making judgments based on our own experience and our own ways of communication and all of these things. And like so often I hear in hiring committees that's a good fit, and my reaction is, are we just responding to them being just like us? Are we open to differences? Are we bringing in people who complement or think differently? And Michael, so I agree completely. And I would also say not just faculty, but staff and as well. Yeah. So I think that is like a great starting place, or one place that really needs to get started, where we can do training and change our hiring practices.
Yeah.
I'm interested in having somebody to motivate different areas of campus, departments, divisions, student service areas to look at their own, to really do a self-assessment, to look at the structures within their system, to look at their policies and procedures, to look at, just to really do a self-assessment and figure out where might they be putting up unintentional barriers that are unequitable, and what could they really, what can we really do to make things, in particular, more racially equitable? Because I think that's a lot, that's what we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So, in addition to the hiring piece, really turning it back to the current staff and faculty we have.
Yeah. Like an internal audit kind of a thing.
Absolutely. Tools for that and time for that work.
The disparity on training opportunities for staff. Not just, I'm talking staff that work night times, staff that work during the weekend, staff that work on campuses versus staff faculty. There are times where everybody but a certain group can go to training opportunity where others are left behind in the dust without that opportunity.
We talked about a number of things, including the need to improve the representation of the populations we serve amongst our faculty and staff, both. That is a very clear barrier and challenge on our campus. We also talked about the need to facilitate connection between students, especially as we work in these modalities. We discussed the necessity of candor in our conversations, and that in order to demonstrate candor, we have to have a shared vocabulary, which you're helping to provide us with. We talked about how modality is important in terms of how it's providing a variety of modes in which a student can demonstrate learning is important. And we also just started to talk about stereotype threat and the implications of that for students. So.
Yes. Yeah, all good things. You all covered a lot of ground.
Yes.
Time, and I appreciate you going first, Kelsey. I know it's not always. Okay, so the next hand I saw was Christine Schroeder.
Hi, I'm not on camera, but This is a little bit more, I would say, like immediate action based instead of, systemic and institutional change. And I think some of the issues that we have in, like, I guess, identifying students or identifying needs, because I don't know if other instructors or staff that works with marginalized populations see that those students that need the most assistance don't necessarily speak up, and just telling them resources are available or that you're there for them doesn't mean that they'll necessarily come to you. And so seeing what they're coming in, seeing if they have any language barriers, and we have that information and data often that comes into the institution, it's just not extremely accessible across to everybody that needs it probably. And so changing modalities and changing ways that you might alter some things, or how you might reach out to students, or even having that, I guess, a challenge, and it's more of an infrastructure challenge. And another thing that was mentioned was just even in the ways that we communicate with these students. Email and Canvas isn't necessarily the best way to communicate with them when you can't communicate with them in person. And some institutions have gone into texting, like formats and things like that. And I know with our population of students that we work with, that seems to be, in my program, in the MESA program, that seems to be the best way for our students to actually get contacted, and they communicate with us mostly that way. And so accepting new ways of communication with these students.
Yeah, thank you, Christine. So I'm hearing the need to be intrusive, the need to be able to not only have data, but to actually be able to make sense of it. Because I find that colleges usually have more data than they know what to do with. The challenge we have is, when do we have time to sit and make sense of it, for starters? And then when do we have time to do that collectively with our colleagues, right? That's a challenge. And then communicating with students. How do we communicate with them proactively and effectively, right? So there's a lot of things that you and your group came up with that I think are important. Let's take one more. I saw Rebecca's hand up, and the alert disappeared, so I apologize. What will be your last name?
Ferreira.
Oh, there you are. Yep. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you. I'm going to bring up one that I know is a touchy subject, but is really important, I think, as an institutional problem. And that is something that was brought up earlier by our speakers, with issues with student complaint processes, not just with the need for students to put a name to the complaint, but also when a student is even willing to come forward and go through the process of meeting with the faculty member, the chair, and whoever else, there has just been a lack of willingness to act on those complaints, whether the complaint is being filed against an adjunct or a full-time faculty member.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times when a student has an unpleasant experience, or a student was not well served, the burden of proof really is on the student to prove it, right? And and that's a heavy burden at times. And there can be some reluctance amongst the student, or amongst students, to pursue it for fear of retaliation. Even when the student does it, we don't necessarily have the best processes to act on it. There's even, I would say, our colleagues are in some ways disadvantaged or disincentivized by even saying, hey, yeah, I messed up, right? There's some vulnerability there. So there's a lot of work to be done in that regard. But thank you, Rebecca. And thank you to everyone who took the time to share. I know that the conversations that took place were much richer than we have the time to really get into, but I'm hoping that today just provides, an opportunity for the need, and for the recognition of a need to kind of have more intentional conversations about this. Now, everything, I think all of the institutional actions that were shared, and we didn't get into them deeply, but they all have merit, and they all have promise, in my opinion. But I made this statement earlier, and I'm going to go back to something I shared. When it comes to equity, when it comes to institutionalizing equity, even when institutions take it seriously, and they do all the things that they say you should do to be an equity-minded institution and so forth. The fact of the matter is this: the painful reality is that most institutions never really reach the point of what we would call having successfully institutionalized equity, right? And the reason why that is relatively simple, right? And I'll say, before I share the reason, I spent about a year like really thinking about this and really, sort of staying up at night sometimes. Like, man, why are things really working well at this one place? And this other place, they're doing the same exact things, but things aren't working well at all in that place, right? It's not going anywhere. And so, the reason is fairly obvious in some respects. And, the great thinker and business mogul, Peter Drucker, who's often credited with saying this, is that culture, institutional culture in particular, eats strategy for breakfast. The reason why most campuses are not really successful in actually institutionalizing equity, now I don't mean just kind of doing it here and there and doing it on the side, but I mean successfully institutionalizing equity, is because we focus far too much on strategy and we really don't do the intentional work that's necessary to ready and shape our institutional cultures. So let's take some time to talk about that. Our last framework of the day is yet another taxonomy. And this taxonomy, however, it talks about the interplay between institutional culture and institutional strategy as it relates to equity. So we know, like, culture, right? So I think a lot of us can kind of describe culture and provide examples. I don't know that we often spend a lot of time thinking deeply about it, but culture is reflected in a lot of the elements that we see presented here. Now, for the most part, and I've been involved in equity work for a long time, and I can say, for the most part, our equity efforts don't really address these key elements and factors that really have a profound influence on the culture of an institution. They just don't. Instead, most of our equity efforts focus on strategies, implementing strategies like the ones we see here. And let me be clear, strategies are very, very important. And you cannot institutionalize equity without having good strategies to do it. But strategy at the expense of culture, or focusing on strategy and ignoring culture, usually doesn't get us where we need to be. And let's talk about why they may be, right? So I have found that an institution can have an equity culture that's either equity enriched or equity deprived. Now, the fact of the matter is, every institution is enriched in some ways and deprived in other ways, right? So no one institution is 100% equity enriched, and no one institution is 100% equity deprived, right? Things are a little bit more complex than that. But let's just kind of look at this as an example, and apply this to our taxonomy. And let's talk about, what does an equity-enriched culture look like? So here's some examples here. Quick snapshot. Again, by no means an exhaustive list. Quick snapshot about the difference between an equity-enriched culture and an equity-deprived culture. Here's some examples. On the left are examples of what an equity-enriched culture looks like. On the right are examples of what an equity-deprived culture looks like. Let's take a look at number 3, just as one example. When we see equity as an indicator, as an indication of institutional responsibility, and not just as exclusively an indicator of student performance, this would be one example of an equity-enriched culture, right? Or one indication, I should say. Let's look at some more examples, and I'm going to highlight one here, number 6. We have leadership that's both transparent and unapologetic about the need and intention to prioritize equity as opposed to being fearful and shameful about it, then that might be indicative of an equity-enriched culture. Now, let me say this. I know that now, right, post-George Floyd, institutional leaders are a lot more willing to kind of, be more direct and be more transparent in addressing issues of equity, and in particular racial equity and racism and so forth. But, we got to understand that that really wasn't the case even a year ago, right? There was still a lot of reluctance on the part of some folks, right? So I think for the purposes of our conversation, we got to just make note of that, right? But when we have it, when we have a space and a platform to have conversations, and when we say, hey, this is a priority, then that might be indicative of an equity-enriched culture, okay? So we got culture. Now let's talk about strategy. I have found that an institution that's looking to institutionalize equity can either do it by applying good strategy or bad strategy, right? There are good strategies, there are bad strategies. I will say this, when I was conceptualizing this taxonomy, I initially thought, well, good strategy and no strategy, right? Because good is the opposite. Well, good is the opposite of bad. But I kind of struggled with, and I ultimately decided that no strategy is better than bad strategy, right? So bad strategy, even when we think about the principle and concept of do no harm, bad strategy, I think, probably does more harm than no strategy. That being said, I can be convinced otherwise. But, for the purposes of our discussion today, let's talk about good strategy and bad strategy. Okay, what are some examples? Look at number 3 here. Historically, institutions have only prioritized full-time faculty, executives, and managers in coming up with professional development opportunities, right? That the only people that really got to participate in professional development, that got to go to conferences and got to hear speakers who came on their campuses were faculty and, your senior folks. Today, that is very different in most cases. Today, we see much more representation, much more intentionality, and making sure that the entire campus, right, even our custodial staff and our groundskeepers in some cases, have access to high quality professional development. Because again, regardless of the role that you have at a college, in my opinion, if you work at a college, you're an educator, and you are potentially in a position to be able to serve and support students. And so everybody can benefit from professional learning, and everybody needs to have some investment in them as an educator, right? But that would be an example of good strategy as opposed to bad strategy. Let's look at one more. Take a look at number 8 here. When we provide intentional spaces for folks to engage in difficult but necessary dialogue about race, racism, and racial equity, that would be an example of a good strategy. Now, I know everybody's talking about it today. Prior to George Floyd, that was not the case, right? So we got to be mindful of that. On many campuses, this conversation was often muted, unwelcome, and completely disconnected from any conversation about equity. And so we're gonna actually talk about this a little bit more shortly. But let's go back to our taxonomy. We could have an equity-enriched culture with good strategy, right? And that's obviously the most desirable place to be as an institution. And what I'm gonna tell you what's likely to happen when we find ourselves in any one of these positions. But this is where we ultimately want to be, right? Equity-enriched culture where we're applying the best possible strategy. Now, we also know, however, that we could apply the same strategies that are considered good strategies, but we can be applying them in an equity-deprived culture. Or we can be applying bad strategy in an equity-deprived culture, which is obviously the least desirable state or the least desirable place we want to be. Or we can be applying bad strategy in an equity-enriched culture. And I'm going to tell you what's going to happen there. So here's what we know. When we apply good strategy in an equity-enriched culture, we're likely going to be very effective in institutionalizing equity, right? Equity is really going to be centered and present and really visible at our institution, right? And everything that we do as an institution. And of course, I'm going to talk about what do we need to do in order to do that, but stay with me for a minute. When we apply good strategies in an equity-deprived culture, then all of our efforts are going to be external and at the margins of the institution, right? They're never going to penetrate what we call the institutional core. So equity will always be something that rests over there somewhere outside of the core of institution. It's never going to make it into conversations about budget and hiring and strategic planning, right? It's always going to be something that happens on the margins of the institution. Now, when we apply bad strategy in an equity-enriched culture, we're actually likely going to see some success here and there, but we're not going to have any understanding or not going to understand why it happened, how it happened, and we're certainly not going to be able to replicate it. And then, of course, when we apply bad strategy in an equity-deprived culture, then we're going to be completely inept when it comes to institutionalizing equity. And now, to further complicate matters, I also think it's important to recognize this, right? We could be really good and really effective in institutionalizing equity for certain populations, right? We might be really good with Pell eligible students, or really good with doing some great stuff around, first gen students, but really bad when it comes to men of color, and really bad when it comes to adult learners or students with disabilities, right? And so I say all that to say that we have to be incredibly intentional, first of all, right? And we really have to make sure that we're using data and that we're really looking at who are our disproportionately impacted students to guide our decision-making in terms of how we institutionalize equity. That's important. But, we can never really rest on our laurels and be comfortable with where we are, right? This is an ongoing process for most institutions. And so some of you may be asking and wondering, like, okay, Frank, this all sounds well and good. How do we do this? And here's what I have to offer. So one of the first things that we have to do, right, and I'm presenting this at an institutional level, but the same things that I'm discussing also applies at a divisional level or department level, at any unit level. Right, we can kind of have the same conversation. But one of the things that we have to do is we have to have a transparent assessment of where we are as an institution as it relates to equity. Like, where are we? Where are we equity enriched? Where are we equity deprived? Where's our choir, right? Where do I have resistant? The key here is to take a hard, honest, non-judgmental look at how we feel about equity, and in particular racial equity as an institution. How do we feel about it, right? To what degree is it really a priority? Then we can talk about strategies, but it's not just about any strategy. It's about choosing strategies that align with the realities of the institutional culture. Choosing strategies that's going to have some degree of success, that's going to get us some positive momentum and get us moving in the right direction, right? So it's not just about applying strategies because the college down the road did it or a college in our district did it. We have to apply the strategies that are well aligned with who we are and where we are as an institutional culture as it relates to equity, right? And while we're doing that, we also have to develop a transparent vision of the campus culture with equity at the core, right? So the messaging there, it has to be, hey, this is where we are as an institution, right? We do really well in these respects with these students on these metrics in these ways. We're really good with hiring. We're really good in curriculum. We really struggle in these other areas, right? So this is where we are, but this is where we should be. And this is what it's actually going to take to get there. So we have to be committed to the work. And this is, by the way, this is not all on President Johnson, right? So what I hope we won't do is leave this conversation and say, wow, President Johnson, based on what Frank shared, you have a lot of work to do. This is a collective responsibility, right? Everybody has to play a role in this and has to assume some responsibility for this. We also have to engage in strategic messaging. We have to align our institutional values and priorities with equity. So, and the sense making there is we could actually achieve it, right? We can achieve racial equity as a college. We can do it. It's possible. We can do it. Now, not only can we do it, but we have to do it because it's aligned with who we say we are and what we say we value as an institution. So we can't say this is who we are and this is what we're about and have some of these disparities that we have with regard to student success, or have the disparities that we have with regard to hiring, right? Or faculty staff representation, or, you know, some of the racialized incidents that may be occurring, right? Those things are disconnected. We can't say that this is what we are and this is what we value as an institution and allow these other things to be happening. And we have to do it with some urgency. So we can't say we'll wait and do it later, or we'll wait till the budget gets better. Like, we have to do this because we are a community college and we have an entire community of people who are relying on us to get this done, get it done right, and get it done with a sense of urgency. And when we do it,
I'm here.
Well, it's actually going to make us a better institution, right? That's how the messaging has to flow. And then, you know, I'm not really big on you know, symbolism, but I do think it's important, and I do think it has a place in this conversation. So we have to have tangible indicators of equity throughout the institution, on our signs, in our buildings, in designated spaces, in our pictures, in our branding, on our website. All right. We have to have that. That's important to have. And we also have to create a shared accountability for a commitment to equity. So this means having some conversations around how is equity and a commitment to equity going to be reflected in how we hire folks, in our tenure and promotion processes, how faculty are evaluated, how staff are evaluated with regard to performance evaluation. Now, I know there's some collective bargaining implications with what I just said. So by no means am I suggesting, you know, first that, you know, those relationships be violated. But I mean, you know, we all have to come together and have some real conversations and come up with some real actions that's going to allow this to be important and be a priority. And then this last one is one that I'm going to spend a little bit of time on because it's really important. And that is, we have to address campus racism with urgency and with transparency. Now, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about this, and then this will bring us up to, you know, the Q&A period. And then, you know, I'll be happy to kind of have some dialogue, thoughts and reactions with what folks have to say, hear some questions and so forth. But bear with me here for the next several minutes. Part of being race conscious and a big part of being an equity-minded educator is understanding that, you know, while the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and Tony McDade and Sean Reed and far too many others have sparked this national movement against anti-Blackness, the lives and minds of people of color have never really been truly and fully valued in our country. And so what we see here is a small snapshot of the many racialized atrocities that have been enacted systematically to destroy the lives and opportunities of people of color. And that, you know, while this is a new for many folks, this is kind of a revelation or a new sort of a new thing. This fight for racial justice has been going on for centuries, for a very long time, right? And so that's the first thing we have to recognize. We also have to understand what racism is and how does it operate, right? So when we look to the work of Ibram Kendi, who wrote the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, what he says is racial inequity is really the result of racist policies that are justified by racist ideas, right? So we have racist policies, they're justified by racist ideas. That's what gives us racial inequities, right? And so we often think about policies in a very formal sense. So about, you know, things that are written like laws and executive orders, and that's important. But I also want us to think about informal policies and informal practices sort of the take it for granted things that we do as educators and the take it for granted things that happen at an institution that are justified by racist ideas that ultimately result in racial inequities, right? And let me provide a few salient examples, right? So some racist policies that have been with us for a long time: school segregation, redlining, mass incarceration, right? I think all of us probably have, at a minimum, have heard of these three things. But these three racist policies have long been justified by racist ideas. School segregation was justified by the idea that Black and Indigenous people of color are intellectually inferior to whites. Therefore, they shouldn't be educated in the same schools, shouldn't get the same investment and resources with regard to education, shouldn't get what they get, right? Redlining, which is the policy and the practice where that made it difficult for minoritized communities to get loans to purchase real estate. It's rooted in the idea that Black and Indigenous people of color are financially irresponsible, and that an investment in them and an investment in their community comes with significant financial risk for lenders. And then we have mass incarceration, which stems from the idea that Black and Indigenous people are prone to violence and crime. They need to be policed more harshly. They need to be more sentenced. They need to be sentenced more harshly. And that's what ultimately gives rise to mass incarceration. All of these ideas, all of these policies, combined with the racist ideas that justify them, have given us significant racial inequities, right? And so when we think about the context of education, and we think about how do we really achieve racial equity in a way that's transformational, in a way that's deep, transparently addressing campus racism, right? It has to be a priority. Some ways that we do that, I think as an institution, if you're authentically committed to addressing racism in a transparent, you have to have a transparent and transparent reconciliation of the ways in which people of color and white supremacy I should say racism against people of color and white supremacy is really rooted in the core and the history and the legacy of the institution, right? So you got to learn what were some of those early policies, what were some of those early practices, what were some things that were enacted systematically that denied opportunities to people of color, right? Both the students and that denied opportunities for those who've had the opportunity to work there. And how are they sanctioned, right? How are they justified? And I say institutions that are really committed to doing this should think about convening a task force to lead this effort, making sure you have a broad group of stakeholders, faculty, staff, students, community members, having someone with some expertise in history and archival research. Those are all very helpful things to do, right? And it's important to share what you learn publicly. Have a real conversation about, this is our history. This is what's happened. These are some of the things that, that's rooted in our history that we still practice today, that still have a real salient impact on the things that we see in terms of racial inequity today, right? And you have to identify tangible ways to atone for it. So it's not just enough to uncover it and present it. You got to come up with ways to atone for it, right? So thinking about scholarships and named programs and tuition waivers, right? Ways in which you can kind of reconcile that history as an institution. We also have to do a better job, I think, of what I call lifting minoritized voices. So, making sure that you give students and even employees the opportunity to tell their story, to talk about their lived experiences at the institution, to talk about how they've been disadvantaged in some ways, because telling your story can be both instructive and healing. Now, it has to be done systematically. It has to be done with some rigor. And then, there's several questions that should guide this inquiry. Some are presented here on the screen. And it's also important to recognize that, again, there's a lot of intersectionality that exists even within communities. So when we talk about Pacific Islanders. There's a lot of intersectionality that exists within that community. So being intentional, making sure you believe folks when they say it, right? So I have seen institutions kind of do this, and they engage in these inquiries, and they don't leverage the findings because they don't like what they found. And so, it's things like this that allow inequities to persist. And so I think it's important to believe what folks are telling you, and to make the findings public as well. And then we need to think about, how do we address racism in our campus culture? In particular with a focus on our curriculum, in our student services and our hiring practices. Hiring practices, it can be a real site for racist policies that we don't even recognize. And so thinking deeply about our position descriptions, how our committees are formed, what happens when a candidate visits campus, if we have grievances for employees, how are those things handled? How does this come into performance evaluations, right? All of these processes, have to be addressed and thought about systematically in order to really, get at the core of institutional racism. We also have to devise a comprehensive strategy to address racism. So I spoke about this a little bit, but right now we see a lot of institutions releasing statements of support and solidarity in response to anti-Black racism. And while these are nice and they feel good, but for the most part, they tend to be devoid of concrete actions that must be taken to address it. And so I think there's some things that we have to do that can move us closer to where we need to be. If an institutional strategic plan is ultimately decides what an institution values and what it invests in, then, and if addressing racism and becoming an anti-racist institution is indeed a priority, then it has to be articulated in a strategic plan. And you have to have measurable goals, and you have to have resources that are allocated specifically towards achieving those goals. Mission statements, they tend to be symbolic, but in many ways they do reflect institutional values. And so there should be some reference to being an anti-racist institution in the mission statement, if that is indeed an institutional priority. And then thinking about how do we make sure our governing board is a part of this conversation, right? How do we keep them informed? How do we keep them educated? How do we keep them updated? How do we provide professional learning opportunities for them? Because they may not always know what's happening or how to make sense of things. And then finally, and then there's one more slide after this one, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. But one of the most persistent and transparent indicators of racial inequity is when students of color don't achieve the same outcomes as their peers. And so this is the case at most institutions. And so the student success data, much like the data that we started the presentation with today, that has to continue to happen, has to be disaggregated on a routine basis. You have to have, I would say it should be disaggregated not just at the institutional level, but also at the departmental level and even down to the program level. And you have to have opportunities for folks to get together, to discuss the data, to make sense of it, and to come up with actionable strategies in response to it. So Estella Ben-Simone, who I referenced earlier, has developed a framework called the Equity Scorecard that kind of provides some guidance on this. And this, there's a reference to it at the bottom of this slide. And she talks about these 4 perspectives and the type of data that you can look at. I think the data, at least the data that was shared with me, I know that was a snapshot, but that was shared with me in preparation for this presentation. I think those are great data that can really elevate conversations around racial inequity if they're actually used accordingly. And so, given that, and given everything that we've talked about today, there are some key takeaways here. Our statewide leaders, so the folks, in Olympia, in you all's case, in Sacramento, in my case, they can give us policies, but all they really can give us is strategies, right? They really can't shape our institutional cultures. that responsibility falls on us at the institution. And so we have to assume some responsibility for that. We also know that strategies alone don't close equity gaps, that we really have to pay close attention to equity culture. We have to spend more time on equity culture during the early rollout phases of any type of equity efforts, right? That's when we really got to observe it and think about it. And culture is most visible when it's observed organically, right? So folks often say, hey, Frank, do you know a consultant we could hire, or do you know about a survey or some kind of inventory that we can do to get a better sense of our equity culture? And there's a lot of people that you could hire that would do a good job. But one thing we do know is that culture is most visible when it's observed organically. So I would say pay close attention to hiring, sit in on a hiring committee, sit in on a budget committee meeting, sit in on a curriculum committee meeting. I serve on a curriculum committee for my college, and I got to tell you that sometimes those are the most intense conversations I have about equity, is when it's focused on curriculum. And we also know this, that when it comes to racial equity, most institutions are not well equipped when it comes. They're pretty much inept or resistant when it comes to racial equity. And that's because we usually don't get the type of professional development that we need as educators starting in graduate school to really have productive conversations, to not only have to not lead productive conversations, but even to have productive conversations about race and racial equity, right? We have a lot of work to do in this regard. And then we often get caught up and overwhelmed by resistance, but we also have to understand that toxic support, so if we think about the oblivious, that is just as bad, if not worse, than toxic resistance, right? And so given all that, given everything that we've talked about today, I just want to thank everybody I know this was a long day on Zoom for you all. I want to thank you for spending some time with me today. I hope you found at least one thing that I had to share today insightful and value added, and find that it gives you some tools and resources to do your work better. With that, I'm going to stop the screen share. I believe we have about 10 more minutes for Q&A. I think the plan is we're going to just kind of let folks unmute themselves and ask the questions that come to mind. I will make the slides available. So if anyone would like to have the slide deck, I'm going to share it with Tanya. And so I don't know the process for distributing them, but I will make the entire slide deck available to anyone that needs some good bedtime reading and struggling with insomnia in any way. So, all right, thank you. Q&A.
So please go ahead and put your questions into the chat, and I will go ahead and relay them to Dr. Harris as they come through.
Yeah. Thank you, Georgiana. Sorry.
That's okay.
That's what we decided, yes.
I'm used to it. Could you perhaps mention a little bit about, I saw this in one of your SEAL presentations, about pushing in when regarding members on campus who are actively resisting and actively defiant as far as trainings went?
Yeah. I mean, sometimes that can be challenging. So first of all, I think it's important. The goal is to achieve critical mass, right? And to get momentum and to create a context where it's kind of uncomfortable to be an active resistor or actively defiant. So that's the goal. And so I think you first focus on your allies, and you really focus on building capacity amongst your allies, right? That's where you start. And then with regard to active resistors, so I find that a lot of active resistance happens because it's folks who feel like there's a conversation that's happening, there's an initiative that's moving forward, or some inertia that's moving forward, and they don't have a role or a part to play in it. And so sometimes I think part of it is just having a transparent conversation and say, hey, yes, Frank, you may not identify as a person of color, right? Or you may not identify as someone who represents one of our disproportionately impacted populations. But you have an important role to play. And you don't necessarily have to be a person of color in order to serve and support and work well with a student of color. Now, representation absolutely matters, right? So I'm not saying that, there shouldn't be intentional efforts to make sure that there's more representation. But I don't think that I think sometimes we assume, particularly for our white colleagues, we don't necessarily do as good of a job as we can do in sort of, helping them understand the role that they play in efforts around racial equity. We know allyship is really important, right? When we look at any social movement, or when we look at any progress towards any type of social justice, allies, are usually at the center of that. And so I think we have to do a better job of pulling folks in and helping them recognize, their role in this would be a starting point.
Wonderful. Okay. Yes, it's all that psychology that we have to actively use. I'm going to go ahead. I have a couple questions here in chat. So the first I'm seeing here is, what are some of the most common approaches, tactics that the oblivious take that we should call out?
Well, I think that the challenge with the oblivious, like, no one is intentionally oblivious, right? I think, most folks, when they are oblivious, they don't recognize it as such, right? It's unconscious and implicit. And so, and I often say, just like we can't have deficit perspectives about our students, we also can't have deficit perspectives about our colleagues, right? And so I think with the oblivious, it's sort of raising awareness. It's helping folks understand, like, hey, yeah, I know conceptually you get down with racial equity and you find it important, but we have to do a better job of creating alignment between what you're saying and what you're doing, and helping folks see the disconnect, right? Because again, with the oblivious, no one usually knows that they are oblivious, right? It's kind of like I had someone in a workshop say, like, identified themselves as a narcissist, right? And I said, well, most narcissists wouldn't admit to being a narcissist, right? Because that's, right, a narcissist wouldn't even realize that, right? And so I think it sort of works in the same way with the oblivious, right? It's usually unawareness about the disconnect between what you say and what you do. Now, I will say this, and I think this is important, and I don't know that I articulated it all that well in today's presentation, but all of us at one point we could all be oblivious at certain points. We could all be resistant at certain points, right? So these sort of indicators or perspectives are not tattoos, right? They're really more like name tags that you go to a conference, you get a name tag. And so I think self-awareness plays a real key part here as well. And recognizing that, for me, for example, like, yeah, I do training, I do work around racial equity and so forth, but I still have some work to do. I still have some things I don't know. I still have some populations that I may not be as well, have as good of do a good job understanding in terms of lived experiences as it relates to systemic oppression. And so the one thing one message I hope that we don't walk away with is that if we're a part of the choir, we're always a part of the choir, right? Because, once you feel that way, then you kind of get comfortable. And once you get comfortable, you stop growing and you stop challenging yourself to be better and do better, is what I'll say.
Yeah. I have a follow-up question here. Let me see. Can you give some more examples of ways that accountability can be measured in regards to increasing racial equity, say for faculty or staff? Also referencing the racial equity scorecard system that seems to be very useful.
Yeah, so the racial equity scorecard is really more of a framework for measuring student equity and student success outcomes. With regard to accountability, in education, accountability is sort of written into how we are evaluated in terms of how we perform our work. So, for example, as a faculty member, I'm evaluated every semester by my students in these course evaluations. I don't think we ask any questions, at least, at San Diego State, about, how well do I infuse equity-minded practices into my teaching, right? Or how well did I support students and kind of meeting them where they are and helping them overcome barriers, systemic barriers that had an impact on their experiences and success in the class, right? But if I knew I was being evaluated on those things, I'm speaking hypothetically, then I might pay more attention to them. I might pursue more opportunities to get better at those things. And I might actually do those things, right? And so that's where I think it sort of happens from a faculty perspective. I also feel like tenure and promotion is a real big part of this. So, so I'm a full professor at San Diego State. When I was going through the ranks, I don't think I ever had to really, account for anything as it relates to, infusing equity-minded practices into my work as a faculty member. But I would have paid more attention to those things if I knew that that's how I was being evaluated, right? And I'm sort of using myself as an example, as a hypothetical example. Obviously I do research in this area, so, it obviously it was a big part of my process. But, for those who don't have the benefit of being an educational researcher, right? Someone who teaches English or someone who's teaching math, right? Or someone who's teaching psychology, where equity is not kind of, and equity-mindedness may not necessarily be a part of what they do. Well, then how do you infuse that into both hiring practices and in the processes for tenure and promotion? Long conversation, the union has to be on board, the Senate. I mean, I know there's a lot that has to happen, but I think that's ultimately where we need to be if we really want to, get folks, particularly faculty folks, to be more committed and take it more seriously. On the staff side, in our performance evaluations, same thing. We're evaluated each year, right? When I have a conversation with my supervisor, we're going through my performance evaluations. What are the metrics that's guiding that conversation? And how am I being, first of all, how am I being coached to be more equity-minded in my work, right? How am I being coached and supported? And then how am I being held accountable in that regard, right? And accountability, we tend to think about it in sort of this punitive way, right? And I think we have to, accountability is not about punishing folks. It's really about building capacity for folks to be better at what they're doing. It's probably the best way to think about it. I recognize we're way out of time. I really enjoyed this engagement. I hope everyone else did as well. Thank you, Georgina, for being a fantastic host. And again, thank you for the wonderful introduction. And I hope to have the opportunity to visit Green River in person one day. And I'll make sure I wear my hoodie when I do.
Maybe we'll get one of those gator suits for you.
Yeah, right.
I wanted to remind everybody that you can follow Dr. Frank Harris III on Twitter at FHHarris3 and on Instagram at frank.h3. And we also put a bunch of the wonderful bodies of work that he has worked on in the chat. Would you be all right if we forwarded some of the emails that we capture forwarded some of the questions from our chat to you?
Yeah, that'd be great. I would do my best to respond to all of them.
Well, Absolutely. Thank you so much. It has been such an honor. We truly, truly are so astounded at this amazing approach to racial equity. And I, for one, will try and use it in my personal practices. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Georgina. If I could offer this last parting word, is don't try to do everything all at once, right? Just try a couple things and continue to build as you gain momentum is what I would offer. Thank you.